Good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all with us. This is the third webinar that is organized jointly by the Institute for Sustainable Development of the European Public Organization, EPLO, and diaNEOsis. And it is my pleasure to welcome Thodoris Georgakopoulos, who is the editorial director of diaNEOsis. And we have with us two expert speakers, two actually very renowned speakers and figures in their field. The first one that you see is Άρης Βρεττός, who is the director of the Center for Business Transformation of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Ari, thank you for being with us. And the second speaker is Sébastien Treillet, who is the executive director of Ητρίτη, the Institute for Sustainable Development and International Relations from Paris. It's a great pleasure to have you both with us. And as a matter of introduction, I will say just a few things that, as I said before, this is the third webinar that we are organizing, looking into the effects of the COVID pandemic and how this relates to sustainable development. Sorry, the title for this one, the third webinar, is called The Silent Spring in Inverse. Those involved with environmental issues might remember that in 1962, that's even before me, actually, so I'm not that old. My brother is, though. And so in 1962, Reza Carlson put out a book that was named The Silent Spring, and it was about the effect that pesticides had on nature, so that things were becoming more silent, birds, insects, and so on, because of the massive use of DDT and other pesticides at the time. What actually we tried to say by the title of this, this event is that in this case, it was the inverse of a silent spring, because human activity had been reduced to a bare minimum because of the pandemic, because people had to be closed at home with the lockdowns. Air traveling had been reduced to almost zero, traveling in the streets and moving in the streets with cars and so on. So we saw the inverse effect of nature actually regaining some space. We saw life taking place in cities and so on. And the question that we wanted to discuss with our speakers today is that this was an unprecedented experiment. I mean, we never had the possibility to do that in normal times. Unfortunately, we got the chance to do it with a lot of cost for human lives. First of all, a lot of human pain, but also a very high cost to the economy. And still, what we think is worth discussing is if there are any positive outcomes or any positive conclusions or anything positive that can come from this experience and lessons that we can learn for the future in terms of how things are done. What I would propose that we do today is, after I give the floor to Thodoris Georgakopoulos to welcome you on behalf of diaNEOsis, after that we will have a very short quiz. It's a very small quiz of 5 questions that all of you will be able to participate in and vote. I will take you step by step to it so you will know how to do it. And then we will have an introductory remarks by first Άρης Βρεττός and then Sébastien Treillet. And then we'll enter the discussion. Let me remind you that through the Zoom webinar that you are linked in, you can post your questions in the Q&A or the chat. We'll be monitoring both. And so if you want to participate with a question, please feel free to do that. Our team will be monitoring questions and will be passing them to us if we're missing something. And also that for those of you who want to link, I mean, if you're listening to us, that doesn't make much sense what I'm saying, but the whole event is also being transmitted live on YouTube on our channel, which you can find on invitation. With this and without saying anything more, I would like to invite Thodoris to welcome our attendees and our speakers on behalf of diaNEOsis.
Thank you so much, Spiros, again for this invitation to participate in this series of online events. They have something in common. Interesting ideas always come up in these discussions, and I'm really interested in hearing what our guests have in this particular discussion today, because the sustainable development conundrum is even more important and crucial now during a pandemic that has triggered a massive recession around the world. In our country, in Greece, we are facing a severe challenge to drastically change the way we produce our energy over the coming few years. And at the same time, we also have to change our economic model and shift from a heavy reliance on tourism, for example, to industrial production and other export-driven industries. And we need to put more people to work because we already had a massive economic crisis to deal with. So in that framework, I'm really eager to learn about ideas, strategies, and specific policies that have been implemented or are being implemented elsewhere. And I hope that from this discussion today, I and our viewers will be able to translate the general idea of sustainable development into more specific examples and concepts. And I'm really interested in hearing more about these issues and about the concept of Silent Spring, which I found very inventive and interesting.
Thank you very much, Todori. So before I invite our two speakers, I will share with you this short quiz that I mentioned before. What you will see on your screens now, you can actually join either through your computer, or you can use your mobile phones. Usually it's easier to do it through on your own mobile phone. If you go to, if you go to this website, www.menti.com, you will be required to type in the code 610313. Can you please try to do this? I will be monitoring how many people have registered on the Menti. So it's www.menti.com. And as soon as you join, you will be able to see the first card that I will share with you, on which you will be able to vote. There will be 5 statements. You are required to vote which one of the statements you think is correct. There are 3 correct ones and there are 2 wrong ones, and you will be able to vote which one you think is best. I'm still waiting for like a short minute. There's people logging in on Menti. We already have around 15 people that have logged in, and I will just give it a second more so that more people can come on. And now you can start voting. Remember that 3 questions are right and 2 are wrong, so you can vote for whichever you like. And there we go. We have 9 people that voted for reduced pollution and CO2 emissions. We have 3 people voting for less flight miles traveled. And we have 1 person that interestingly voted about less plastic being used, which is not the correct answer. And I think that will be a point that we can discuss later on. So now I'll stop my sharing and we'll go to the introductory remarks by first Άρης Βρεττός from the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and then Sébastien Treillet, who will be invited to comment on things, but there will be more quizzes later on. So don't leave Menti, stay with Menti. Ari, thank you again for being with us, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Spiro, and thank you, everyone. It's good to be involved in this very interesting conversation. Let me just say, if you don't mind, Spiro, just one word about my institute, the Sustainability Leadership at the University of Cambridge, and we are a 30-year-old institute, part of the School of Technology, and we work predominantly with our key audiences are policymakers, the financial system, and business leaders. And we work a lot trying to progress the thinking when it comes to policymaking, supporting organizations who have a voice in what progressive policies looks like. Carbon, climate change, business and nature, and so on. We work a lot with the finance sector. What does a sustainable financial system looks like? With asset managers, with banks, with insurance, you know, what kind of, how do we optimize the impact of portfolios? How can we better communicate and be transparent about the carbon intensity, about the true financial risks of our investments? And then finally, we work a lot, obviously, with businesses. And that's where the Center for Business Transformation comes in, we have a mission to help business play a transformative role toward a sustainable economy. And our goal is to try and get to the big questions. What is the new role of business in society? What is the impact of business? And then what types of strategies enable businesses to play that role? What change is necessary and so on. So that's just a way of introducing CISL, but it will kind of come in handy as I start talking about some of the things that we are looking at in Cambridge. So the first thing to say in a conversation like this is there's a lot we don't know. And a lot of the questions are being asked at the moment. It will take years to kind of address some of those issues, to document them, to record, to understand how some of these themes, how some of these trends evolve. I guess one thing we all know, at least all of us working in sustainability, is this isn't a surprise. However tragic this is, however difficult this isn't really a surprise. We've seen it come up in various scenarios, and we've been preparing for things like this, and what many people say is going to be challenging decades ahead when it comes to climate change and ecological crisis. So that's, as we've entered this era of the Anthropocene, where the kind of the human species has dominated life on the planet, now we're kind of settling to what is being called, I think, the anthropause, the kind of the lockdown, the halt in economic activity that's been created. And we've seen kind of many examples of this. I have monarch butterflies and hedgehogs in my garden for the first time in 7 years here in Cambridge. We haven't had that previously. There's birds singing outside my window every day. But we see it, we've seen reports of kangaroos roaming the streets of Adelaide in Australia. You see alligators in the gardens in US cities. You see deer resting in Southeast London. We've seen the videos from Venice and how the waters of the canals have become much cleaner. So there's many examples. Walruses in Argentina. Wildlife is claiming back in the absence of man. Significantly, the decline, the fall of transport and travel emissions and car transport, and of course all of us working, at least those of us who have the luxury of being able to do so, working remotely from home, we've seen a big halt in global emissions. I think over March and April, we've seen a global decline approximately of 17% of CO2 emissions. China has, which has been hardest hit to some degree by the crisis, has seen reductions in CO2 equivalent to what the UK emits in half a year. You've seen pictures of the north of Italy and the quality of air and how that has changed dramatically. And of course, there's the other side to that coin is that it has had, as you said, a big social and human and economic cost. So the other thing that's kind of significant for me is that with all this halt, there's very little happening to some degree, we still emit sort of 87 or 85% of our annual emissions. The system is in motion, and there is a lot of momentum in the system. And some scientists kind of describe it as, to look at carbon dioxide, as a bathtub that's slowly filling up, and then suddenly you reduce the flow of the tap. It's still filling up. We still have to get rid all of that carbon from the atmosphere, for example. But we have seen some very interesting ways about some interesting things about what is possible, and I think we're going to talk about that in the next couple of minutes. And what is it that we have been able to do, and what is it that we think we're going to learn as a result? I think this isn't a positive story. We have to be clear about that. We didn't choose to do this, and maybe we choose to do some of the things that we're doing at the moment in the future, but we haven't chosen to do this. And you know, in the UK where I live, you've seen something like 20% of lost GDP. You've seen the biggest rise in unemployment since records began, I think. You've seen entire sectors where a lot of people rely for jobs, livelihoods, and so on, and to kickstart the economy, completely obliterated. You mentioned tourism and leisure. That's been one of the sectors hardest hit. Obviously, transport and many other areas, retail, have been really affected. That has brought, you know, some wonderful examples from company reactions, people reactions, community reactions, which I'd like to flag as we move on to the conversation. But you know, it has raised, you know, exacerbated some of the issues we faced. Inequality is one. You know, it's, you know, most of us on this call have the luxury of continuing to work and earn a living. But, you know, tradesmen, people working in construction, people, you know, driving cars for a living, they've been the hardest hits. And so you see how, you know, the crisis landed on a plane of economic inequality, and it's making it bigger and bigger. And of course, you know, you know, the movement of Black Lives Matter and other similar movements kind of are an interesting reflection of what's happening in this trend. So I'll pause here. There's many examples that we can bring into this conversation, a lot of interesting lessons, but again, I want to highlight a lot of questions that we're just starting to look into and we'll need to revisit over the next couple of months and years.
Ari, thank you very much. I'm really grateful for all the points that you raised. Actually, the Monarch Butterflies is something that I noticed in my own garden, and we were discussing that with my wife the other day, that we've never seen such a concentration of butterflies and many other species. But I think all the socioeconomic points that you raised as well are very, very valid. I will not comment on them, and I will not ask Theodoris to do it right now, because I would like to invite Sébastien Treillet of Ητρίτη to take the floor and do your opening remarks. Sébastien, thank you again for being with us. You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Just a few words also on where I'm speaking from. So Ητρίτη is a think tank established in Paris, but we work both on domestic policies, meaning the French and the European policies on sustainability, but also on international negotiations. And I think I'm going to talk mainly from the French perspective. That might be quite useful. I think the first thing that strikes me, I really like the way that you put this idea of a reverse silent spring, because it's really enabling us to reflect on what's happened and also putting the emphasis on nature and not just on climate. And I think that's very important if we try to think of what can we learn. To some extent at Ητρίτη, we work both on climate change and biodiversity degradation. And even if climate change seems complicated as a collective action problem, biodiversity degradation is even worse. So to me, putting the emphasis on that is particularly important. The thing that struck me, seen from Paris and the room in which, the flat in which I was confined, is the idea that, yes, it was impressive to see the decrease in greenhouse gases emissions, but to some extent, it's really showing that our economy we just have one big switch, binary switch on the economy, which means that either we have economic growth that is a kind of a necessary condition for prosperity today and environmental degradation, or we have environmental protection, but then we need to say bye-bye to economic growth, and that means also bye-bye to prosperity. So what I mean by that is that first, it's really showing that we have not succeeded in the dematerialization of our economy, which has been a promise or a kind of an horizon, not a promise, but an aspirational horizon for sustainability policies. So decoupling economic growth from its material footprint has not functioned for the moment. And the other thing that is important is that for the moment, if we don't have growth, we don't have prosperity, we don't have social insurance, we don't have a social welfare state. And that's also something that is very important. So because I believe in sustainability, what we are aiming for is prosperity and not growth. But if we want prosperity for the moment, we don't know how to do that without growth and the environmental impact that goes with it. So to some extent, I think it would be very dangerous to try and convince the rest of society, those who are not in favor of sustainability, not necessarily in favor of sustainability policies. If you convince them by showing, look, it's possible, we can just switch off the economy and then everything is going to be good. The brutality of the social consequences is very harsh. And for this, we need to really use that example just to show that things that we thought were not possible are certainly possible, but it does not mean that it's the brutality of the lockdown is something that we can't cope with it, because we need much more progressive transitions. At the same time, while I really know that the emergency, the environmental emergency, is very important. So there is an issue of the time frame that we can afford that is very complicated and illustrated by the crisis. The last thing that I want to say on that is that, of course, I've discussed that with colleagues in India, in China. Even for those who have lost their jobs, they can really notice that cities had become more livable. Levels of air pollution and the health conditions of people had really changed in cities. So to some extent, one of the lessons is also to show that some of our economic structures in some sectors or the organization of our cities are unsustainable, because we have in front of our eyes the idea that it could be differently organized and much more livable. But of course, it takes time to do that. So that's this idea of a big switch to me is very important. The other thing that I think I would like to introduce as a question is, because that was implicit in your questions, Spiros, was the idea of lifestyles. We've changed our lifestyles. Why not change our lifestyles and be more sustainable? And I think that's something that is very, very, very complicated. The French philosopher Bruno Latour has said, we've learned the barrier gestures against the virus. Let's learn the barrier gestures to avoid getting back on the tracks of unsustainable development. But that's a very strange way. I mean, he's very smart, but if you listen just to the title of the paper, looks like it's an individual responsibility, and we could just choose to live differently. And that's very complicated, because I think he was appealing more to public mobilization, collective mobilization, than just individual behaviors. But I think what was interesting in the crisis was the level of philosophical reflection through irony that people had. And I mean that by this, probably everybody, not just we, the well-educated in some, because we have a superior education. I mean, everybody was looking on their smartphone to the irony of the situation. And that is very good for our philosophical reflection. But, and so many people were, I believe everybody was reflecting about what is the priority, what is the meaning of my life, but without, you can't now say that this enables everybody to choose, because some of the people cannot afford to change their lifestyles and behaviors because they need to go and have a job even when the virus is there. They need to use those or this type of transportation because they have no collective transportation, so they need to take the car if they're in a remote place in France. And that links back to the yellow vest movements. What we tried to do, what Macron tried to do, was to try and implement an increase in the carbon tax that was trying to shift the behaviors of people towards less fossil fuel consumption. But in the end, what the protests came from the fact that people could not change that easily when they were in a remote peri-urban area in Montpellier, southern France. You don't have enough collective transportation. Your jobs are far away. You need to use your car, and you have your budget as a household is very, very complicated. So the issue of vulnerability, inequality was very present, and that we should bear in mind when we think that changing lifestyle is possible. And particularly what I think is very present now is that if you would have a public intervention to say, no, you need to change your lifestyle, this idea that we could govern our lifestyles through public intervention, that's good. I mean, the frustration is very hard. People have accepted the types of discipline that we had to have because of health reasons, but they're not going to because that was to some extent to protect the elders, to protect one another or protect oneself. But then if for the sake of the environment, this is going to be unacceptable because people know that it's not their individual choices, because there is the whole structure that prevents them from having choices. And I mentioned the infrastructures for transportation. You could also say, just if you want to buy better food or more environmental food that is more sustainable, maybe you don't access it if you live in a food desert or if the supply, the offer that is proposed by the food industry is not proposing the type of food that you need and that you can't afford to pay. So that to me is very important. And the last point that I would like to make is to say, nevertheless, I think that there are interesting things that might be happening and useful for nature. And that's particularly the idea that some space has been made in some of the industries, and I think of the agri-food industry, because your introduction was on Silent Spring, which is an issue of pesticides. So to what extent can we, for instance, think that the crisis is an opportunity to live without pesticides? And I think that this is a critical question, because we know in France that we've been already trying for more than 10 years. We had in 2008 the objective to say by 2018, we will reduce by half the use of pesticides. And then a comma was added if possible. And then in the end, the objective was just left aside because it was too complicated. And 15 years after that, we still have farmers saying we have no alternative to pesticides, which is not possible in terms, not for them, but for the collective French society, to say we have not developed the possibility. And the thing that I want to say is the question is not so much a technological alternative that is lacking. It's the idea that if you want to use less pesticides, you need to have more diverse crop rotations, more diverse agricultural landscapes, which means more diverse markets. And this is the issue of the food industry, where you need to reintroduce diversity instead of economies of scale, massification, and standardization. Where I'm coming to, I'm sorry, because this might seem like a very strange way to answer your question. I think with the crisis, we hear CEOs of companies like Danone, Emmanuel Faber, so multinational company, but French-based. Faber has been advocating a lot for rediversifying raw materials and products in the food industry as the horizon for a complete new business model in the food industry. But that necessitates to shift completely from a mass production to a rediversified production. And I don't know how he would do that with his shareholders. And he's saying, I need more resilience in my supply chains. Resilience might be helped by diversity. And he has a narrative that might function. So there are things that we could take of the story of the crisis to say, there are some things that we learn, but they're not directly linked to our own lifestyle. It's much more at the structural scale that this might happen.
Thank you very much, Sébastien. You raised a lot of very interesting points that relate not only to the French dimension, but also to the very real life. So I think it came on as a very, very good addition to what Aris told us about the complication and the complexity of the socioeconomic issues, and you connected that to a number of different industries and facets of everyday life. I will not comment on what you said right away. First, I would like to ask Thodoris if you would like to make any comments on the points that were raised as an introductory remarks by our two speakers.
Well, I have one comment to throw in the discussion. Maybe we can pick up on it later. Picking up from what Mr. Treillet said, I think that the message from the Silent Spring, one of the messages that came out of this Silent Spring, is that climate change and environmental problems in general can be solved by drastically changing our modern way of life. And I think that this is a message that can be dangerous. It's espoused by some activists, but it's not espoused by the vast majority of people. And so on some level, if people agree that we can solve climate change by massive changes in the way our societies and the economies work, then many people will see this as an impossible effort. We cannot sustainably stay locked up in our houses and work from our bedrooms. But people don't want to make drastic changes for prolonged periods of time. And the silence of the spring gave way to a relatively loud summer. So I would like to ask for a comment on that idea. Maybe there is a dangerous message coming out from this Silent Spring, and how we can rectify that.
If I can add something to what you, Thodoris, just said in relation to the comments made by our two speakers, I have 2 points that I wanted to raise on this. One is that I found very interesting the point that Sébastien made about the lifestyles and the need to change lifestyles. And in fact, we have also a question that came from a very good friend to some of us, Arab Hobala, who is also a member of the advisory board of the Institute for Sustainable Development. And one thing he was saying is that in reaction to the pandemic, we have seen a lot of stakeholders, even the very bigger ones like diaNEOsis and so on, that changed a little bit the narrative, and they used what we call very often the greenwashing for sustainability as a pandemic washing. So saying, instead of finding the root causes why we have not managed to address the key issues like climate change and changing the lifestyles and the production and consumption and so on, now we use the same narrative just to make a wishful thinking of what should be done as a result of the pandemic and how everything has to be changed. So I think what you mentioned is important to take into account, that if we drop into the same kind of narrative that we did before for sustainability and we say, let's change everything, we will not change much. And I think that the step-by-step approach and the actual things that we can change. We have been discussing in the past with Άρης about how we actually saw that it is very much possible to avoid a lot of traveling that we used to do because we're running from one meeting to the other. And it turned out that we could do a lot of work just by doing teleconferences. So that saved a lot of traveling, and we could remember this once all the restrictions are lifted. Same thing about what Sebastian said for food production. I think that the pandemic and all these changes, they have actually had a very, very high cost on the livelihoods and the possibility of the poor to be able to support their families. I was speaking yesterday with a friend in France, and he was telling me how much there is a very steep rise in the movement of urban agriculture, how people want to produce more food closer to their homes or within their homes, actually, to stop having this endless chain of transporting food across the globe, because that's how it used to be. So things like that that are connected to real life and are actually meeting a positive reaction from people could be things that we can look at. I'm opening the floor for any comments from Άρης and Sebastian. And when you complete your first round of follow-up remarks, then we'll go to the next step of our voting, if you're in agreement with me. So, Ari or Sebastian, whoever wants.
All right, thank you, Sebastian. I'll go first. Merci. So, I mean, those are very good comments and good question by Thodori. I think you need all kinds of things. I think we need different approaches. We've seen that. We need some incremental steps. We need some low-hanging fruit. We need some genuinely new thinking, and we do need to challenge the system. And I'll tell you, I completely agree. We cannot ask individual citizens to internalize the costs of capitalism, let's call it. You know, this is impossible. So you need a combination of individual action, but to do that, you need some kind of economic system accountability. You need the government regulation and the policies and the science. And the good thing is there's a lot of good things happening at the moment. Lots of good policies around the world, from Chile to the European Union to China, from economies phasing our petrol and diesel cars, from committing to net zero economies by 2050. Scandinavian countries like Iceland have started exploring, alternatives to GDP and the well-being economy. There's a lot of interesting things happening around the world when you look at policies. I think each issue is complicated and needs careful exploration. So food, for example, food production. It's wonderful that people are starting to produce locally, and it depends a little bit how you define it. But we will need trade. We will need trade to produce and feed 60 or 70% of the people around the world. You cannot grow locally for the most part. You can grow different things and you can do different things, but we still rely on trade. And of course, people's livelihoods rely on trade. I think that we all have, more or less, we agree that going back to what was normal before is unsustainable. And there's a push at the moment. Obviously, people want to get jobs and economies back, but that's like saying, what we had previously, it wasn't perfect, but it kind of did the job. And that, you know, that is a completely missed opportunity if we go that way. The second option is what we've been, we've been working on, the Green Recovery Package. Many, the EU, other countries around the world have been calling for a recovery package and activities that put nature. And it's interesting, I completely agree with Sebastian. It's interesting how nature has become the code word for both climate and biodiversity and ecological crisis. I think that's a very positive development, but we're working, build back better, greener, invest in green infrastructure, for example. But that still, in my mind, doesn't prepare us for the crisis ahead. It doesn't build the resilience, the extra level of inefficiency in the system. It doesn't challenge the way we create value. It doesn't challenge the way we distribute that value. It doesn't challenge some of the economic institutions that are responsible for or have been synonymous for where we are at the moment. And so there is a third option here, which is the more radical one, and but it's probably one that is interesting to explore, because especially if we want to think about different types of institutions and models that will be much more resilient in the future. And that's kind of the work that I do with my team at the center. We're trying to explore what type of business can ride the crisis, can be more resilient, can be commercially successful while being inclusive, being restorative, being regenerative, being circular, and so on. And that calls from some big changes in how businesses work, what we mean by excellence, and what we mean by growth, not the quantity, but the quality. And that is a very, it's easy to say, but it's a very difficult conversation to have, particularly when so much is at stake. So that's kind of my, I agree. We cannot ask people to carry the burden, but we have to start challenging everyone to think differently. And hopefully there are some good examples out there that can be a good platform for that.
Ari, thank you very much. Sebastian, would you like to follow on with your comments?
Yes, thank you very much. And I think the question about should we aim for transformation or gradual change is, of course, a question that is integral to the discussion about environmental policy since the, I would say, the 1972 Stockholm Conference, to just say a date, but that's probably even older. I completely concur with the idea that drastic change tomorrow is not possible. But I think we've managed with, for instance, at Ητρίτη we have an initiative called Deep Decarbonization Pathways, where we look at South Africa and India and what it would need, what it means for them to reach the socioeconomic development objectives that they have, meaning particularly reducing the inequality between the Black population and the rest of the population by 2050, and at the same time be low carbon. And to some extent, the idea is to find in the longer run a sequence of change that makes it possible to have those win-win possibilities. And in that specific case, the idea is that if you really want to get more equal South Africa, more equitable South Africa, you need to reduce the political and economic space of the mining sector in South Africa, because that's a trap where the Black population that is trapped in the mining sector cannot actually move up in society. And so this socioeconomic objective is not because of climate. It's just, but if you do it, then if you find the key to do it, because the key question is how do you manage to do that with requalification of workers, etc. Lots of complicated programs. If you manage to do that, then you have lots of climate co-benefits. So that's just to say, of course, it's not just from one day to the other, but there is the idea that what we need is a transformation. And I really like, I'm not sure that maybe it's going to be obsolete in a few years, but the idea that Agenda 2030 is a transformation agenda really shows that what we need to think of that's a very good way to talk to finance people and business people, as Aris was saying, because then you think of the next business model. You understand that some of the businesses and the investments that you had before are actually stranded assets, and you can get into that type of conversation that I think is very useful. The other thing that I wanted to introduce is the idea that in France, we had a citizens' convention on climate as a kind of a response to the Yellow Vest movements. And I've been working with these 150 citizens for nearly 1 year now, and they've issued voted on their final proposals last weekend. They're going to present them to President Macron. And it's really impressive to see that what they say is, they've been asked to develop a set of propositions of public action in order to be in line with 40% reduction in greenhouse gases emissions in France in 2030. And they say two things. First, they say, yes, this mandate is necessary and legitimate. And on top of it, we add ecosystems protection, because if we destruct the ecosystems and try to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, we're not going to be saving the planet, the viability of our society. And I think that's a very strong message from the citizens. And second, they say, we can go there, but that means quite structural transformation in many sectors. And we need to address them from both economic incentives, social accompanying measures, and changes in the way that the business models are actually framed by the norms and the regulation in public policy. So they are answering the government, we could do that, but that needs to really go a step further in the types of regulations that you've been implementing for the moment, and not only through a carbon tax. You have different levers that you need to play on. And that's a very good thing that I think to hear from them. The last thing they said is, I think this is really the atmosphere of the moment, is that to some extent they say we'd be better off if we would be sovereign on a very local scale. And I think that's a worrying message to me, because to me the European project as such is very important for peace, prosperity, and lots of things. And they don't say that they want to Frexit, but they say that very often the competition policy, the trade policy of the European Union is a problem for their transitions. And they have this myth that local is always better, more sustainable. And I concur with something that Theodoris put in the chat, saying sometimes food supply chains need to be resilient, they need to be global, but maybe not the same type of global as we had organized before. So we need to be very cautious about the fact that this idea that relocalizing means more resilience, more sovereignty, and more sustainability is not always clear, and is not always the case. And it's been quite a struggle, for instance, with those 150 citizens, to tell them that first, sometimes if they want to buy local food, is going to be with more greenhouse gas, with more climate impact than something bought from like lamb from New Zealand, shipped, deep frozen. I'm sorry for the lamb producers in France, but sometimes it's right, and it's a problem. I mean, we need to think over that. So sometimes it's not necessarily better in terms of sustainability. And second, if you stop buying cotton from Mali or palm oil from Indonesia, that might be a problem for development in other countries. So we're interconnected also through globalization. So the globalization question, I think, is very problematically framed by the crisis. And we need to be cautious not to directly go to local equals resilience equals sustainability. And that's going to be a tough fight, because to some extent, what the citizens were telling me is that, yes, but in food, if you get the consumer closer to the producer, it would be much easier for the consumer to understand the environmental impacts of what he's buying. And that's right. The only thing is that it's not just because you're close geographically that what is produced is sustainable. But then I think behind what they said, there was a kind of a theory of change that I think we need to consider at least.
Thank you, Sebastian. Theodori, I'm thinking that while you will be preparing to comment on what we just heard, if you don't mind, I will share again the screen of our voting, of our polling, and I will ask all the participants to make sure that they are still logged in on the www.menti.com using the code 610313. We have 13 people that are logged on already. And I will ask you to vote on the next question that you can actually do right now. So you can log on again to the menti.com 610313 for those that are not connected. And you can vote on those points. And you can continue voting on those points. I see more people coming on. And then we will ask you one more question, and you will be able to say freely your opinion about things. And then I think we'll invite Thodoris to comment on what we heard and the closing statements by Aris and Sebastian, because unfortunately, we need much more time for all these very important things that have been pointed out by everybody. What we see in this one is that there is a very important preference of everybody about improving governance, but also we see the importance of urban planning, equally importantly, sustainable goods manufacturing, and the food question that we have been discussing, and of course, disconnecting from CO2 emissions. So I think we can keep this picture the way that it has pretty much been equitably divided between the different questions. Let me give you 1 or 2 more minutes to vote on this question if you like, and then I would like to leave everybody with a final picture that will be provided by this polling. So if you would like me to go now to the next polling question, and the next polling question is this one. It's very simple. What word comes to mind as a result of the pandemic regarding the future? Please feel free to just write 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 words that come to mind. And that would give us kind of a word cloud that will allow us to consider what you think very important in terms of what we should be taking into account. So please feel free. You should be seeing on your screen now the possibility to vote. Is this online already? Christina? Yes? Okay. So please add your words. Our first one, relief for the planet. Sustainability is at the center. That's very interesting. Let us wait for a second until we hear from at least another 20 people like we did for the previous one. Let me remind you that all of this material will be uploaded afterwards on our YouTube. So all of this will be up there for anyone who wants to go back and revisit those points that have been brought up by people. And I think now we have quite a good image of what people are thinking. While people are still voting, Thodori, would you like to take the floor and comment about what we have been hearing?
Sure. I'm very happy with what I have been hearing here today. I expected this, of course. And thank you, Spiros, for facilitating this discussion. I particularly like the examples of South Africa and France, Mr. Trillier mentioned. This is the messaging that seems to work. We want to solve the major social and economic problems of a community gradually. We don't want to blow up society. And we require that the solutions must be sustainability and lower emissions at the same time. Solutions that aren't environmentally friendly are not acceptable. This type of problem solving in policy that is very much in fashion in several sectors of politics around the world is, I think, the way forward. And I also think that the philosophy behind the Green New Deal and new policies, not just environmental, but any policies in the European Union is exactly that. All solutions to problems need to lead to lower emissions and environmentally friendly solutions in the future going forward. And I think that this is the correct message we should come out of the pandemic with.
Thank you, Thodori. Thank you very much. And before you can actually stop voting now, because we see that we have some things that stand out. As I said before, you will have that. And before I close this and thank our speakers, I would like to ask both of you, Ari and Sebastian, if you would like to make a final comment for 1 or 2 minutes. Let me also say, before I open the floor for this, that we've had a number of questions that unfortunately we don't have the time to answer. One of them was related to the first point that in fact, some people thought that we had less use of plastic, but Of course, for the personal protection measures, there was a lot of plastic that was used and is discarded in nature or in the environment as a whole. So there is a problem there. There's plenty of other things. We had questions about who is actually monitoring and taking account of what are the changes that happened in nature and in the environment, what are the institutes. And I think there's quite a lot. Aris is moving his head because certainly Cambridge is one of the institutions that are doing this kind of monitoring, the University of Cambridge, I mean. Sorry for those that put out questions, but for us, they're very valid because there are points that we can take on through our institute, through our collaboration with diaNEOsis to continue our discussion. And with this, I would like to ask Aris and Sebastian to say a last few points that they want to mention for 1 or 2 minutes before we close down this webinar.
Thank you, Aris. Thank you, Spiro. So I really wanted to thank you for this very interesting conversation. I hope we have other opportunities to discuss. And as I said before, we need to build a conversation about Europe within our domestic debates. So being able to exchange with diaNEOsis is very important. And I hope that we have other types of those conversations. So that my first comment is, let's discuss that, because our national political debates and our European political debate, which actually does not exist because it's in the Brussels bubble, we need to have that really organized so that we go forward and that the Green Deal is supported. The last thing the second point I wanted to say is that I've been discussing this morning with Chinese colleagues. And in China, the idea is that, I mean, this is a common word that crisis in Chinese means both risk and opportunity. Everybody says that, but this is really what you see in China is that the speed of change in this global country has been such that they always know that a period of time is just a transitory balance and equilibrium, and that through a crisis, you need to go to the next step. And I don't know exactly what the next step will look like in China. They say that the president is pushing a lot the narrative of digital and green being the new step of modernization of the country. But you also have lots of coal industry workers that are asking for more space in the recovery plans, etc. So what I want to focus on with that is that we've been discussing the speed of change in our countries, seen from at least from our countries, and I think it's important to bear in mind that one of the key things that I could use as an environmental activist to try and push for more audacity, to be more audacious and bold in the way that we try and change the business models with the help of the Green Deal in Europe, is to say that the Chinese won't wait, that they are changing for good or for bad, not necessarily in something that are completely sustainable, but they are modernizing, using the recovery plans after the crisis to change towards a new step in modernization. So we need to do our own if we don't want to be laggards in that type of competition.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Ari?
Thank you. So thank you again, Spiro, and everyone. It's been a wonderful conversation. I wish we had more time. So I'm a different position with Sebastian. So I'm a European, I'm a Greek, and also living in a soon not to be any more European place in the UK. But Cambridge is quite international in a way. I think that we've learned that some very important things, and we now know that wildlife and biodiversity is really important, played a significant role in the crisis when it comes to zoonotic viruses. And we know some of the things that we need to do to prepare ourselves for the future. We saw how people come together around the world to support others. Many examples from Australia, South Africa, the US, of quickly self-organized communities to provide for one another and support the public good. We have many instances where there is, excuse me.
That's okay. We're very happy to have families participating in our
family
webinar.
Situation that we learn how to operate differently these days. So I think there's a way. We saw how we can take radical policies. We saw how we can implement things in a very different way. We saw that there is a possibility for us to make things differently. And we haven't asked those questions. We haven't asked, do we really want to work in a big office? Do we really want to travel to work every day? What is it that we value? And now you also get to meet my son. What is it that
That's great.
Is it family that we value in these situations? Do we like to spend more time at home? But I guess for me, the reality is that we need business to ask very difficult, we need people to ask very difficult and different questions than the way we've done in the past. And to accept at the center of it all is inequality. We cannot address the environmental and the nature crisis without addressing the big inequity issues in our society, because no one will care about some of these issues until they have bread on the table. So I'll leave you with that, and the economic model that provides equity for all, that's at the center of what I think we need to do.
Thank you very much, Ari. And I want to thank all of you. Thodori, I'm sure that you will agree with me that this was one of the most rich in issues about debating webinars that we have organized in the series of those webinars that we had, the third one this time. And I want to thank, first of all, Thodoris and diaNEOsis for being with us, but also the two speakers for bringing up such a very rich thematic discussion. I want to thank all of the audience that has been with us, all of you participants that provided questions and points. Obviously, there is no time, and it is a very complicated issue to try to summarize or bring up the key points. But I would just like to bring up the very important issue related to the need for change that also people that voted brought up on how this will be done without actually bringing more pressure or harm to people that have already been suffering through this time, but also the importance of keeping the geographical and institutional points that are necessary in terms of European Union, of how individualism and also the sovereignty issues are related. Because I remember that one speaker in a previous webinar was saying that this issue is too big to not address at a local level. So we need a balanced view of these different things. Thodori, please say any final point you would like if you want to say goodbye to our viewers. And then we'll just close it down.
To you, Spiros, and to our viewers. And this will all be available on YouTube, I think, so everyone who has missed part of it can see it again. Thank you very much to our speakers as well. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all, and thank you for being with us. We'll let you know when the next one is coming up. Have a great evening, and thank you. Bye-bye.